If you're self-employed, a business owner, or a tax resident in Spain, Hacienda will be watching you even more closely than they are right now from 2026. A new law published earlier this year will come into effect in January that will give the tax authorities even greater oversight and visibility as to what you're doing with your money. So in this video, I'll give you the background, the key points of this law, and what it means for you. Let's get right into it. So the law we're talking about here is Royal Decree or Real Decreto 253 from 2025. This is an amendment and an addition essentially to existing anti-tax fraud legislation to give greater oversight to the tax authorities, particularly when it comes to digital payment methods, which we'll talk about in more detail as we go through what are the digital payment methods that we're talking about here. With the overall goal here being to essentially tackle tax fraud and income from what is known in Spanish as the economía sumergida, the informal economy, we could essentially call it in English. And so there are a number of key measures starting on the 1st of January 2026 that will impact, as we said, self-employed people, business people, and individuals who are tax resident in Spain. So the first is that previously there was a €3,000 threshold for financial entities and banks to have to report certain transactions to the tax authorities when it was a business transaction, essentially. That threshold is essentially being removed. So now any business transaction is reportable to the tax authorities by banks and financial entities. And previously this information was passed on once a year to the tax authorities by the banks and financial entities. That's now going to be on a monthly basis going forward. So those first reports will go out in February for January transactions. And so essentially this is the 170 form, a new form that's been brought in. And on a monthly basis, it will essentially capture any transactions made via, for example, a card payment terminal. But what is now also being brought into the scope of that is Bizum. So Bizum is like a mobile payment method. I've talked about it a couple of times on the channel already. But a lot of businesses do receive money by Bizum. And from the moment this new law comes in, essentially, whereas before there were limits as to what was reportable, again, regarding Bizum, that's going to disappear essentially. So all Bizum transactions will end up in that monthly report along with any payments made by card payment terminal. So it's going to be very important going forward for both businesses and entrepreneurs who are doing both quarterly declarations for their monthly income and for their VAT income, as well as their annual summaries, to include all these movements in their summaries, essentially. Because all that information is getting passed from your bank, essentially, to the tax authorities, and they can cross-reference it between your declarations and those reports to ensure that nothing is being missed. So as you can see now from this, a greater visibility and perhaps a greater control or scrutiny over business transactions, both for businesses and solo entrepreneurs. But even if you're not a business or sole trader, there are new parts of the legislation that come in that could potentially impact you as well. And so in addition to the new forms brought in for solo entrepreneurs and businesses, there are 3 new forms brought in for individuals that banks will have to provide to the tax authorities. The first one being Form 196, which essentially informs the tax authorities about any bank balances on the 31st of December of that tax year. Also, any new bank accounts that have been opened over the course of the year will also be reported in that form. The second form is Form number 181, which will inform about any loan balances, mortgage balances, or property transactions that have been done via the financial entity. And the third one, and perhaps the one that most stands out of the 3 of these, is the 174 form, which banks and financial entities will need to provide to the tax authorities when someone spends more than €25,000 by card in the tax year. Now we need to break down the details of exactly what this means and what is included. So obviously, if you have a bank card with a Spanish bank, then that's going to fall into the scope of reporting. There's a lot of people who also have accounts or debit cards with the likes of Wise, N26, Revolut, that are pan-European entities, but not necessarily registered or overseen in Spain. These entities, nevertheless, if they're issuing their cards to a tax resident in Spain, they are also required to fulfill this obligation. So if you have a Wise or a Revolut card, for example, and you're a Spanish tax resident, you're living here, and you're spending more than €25,000 on those cards per year, then Wise, N26, Revolut, etc., they will all technically have to report that to the Spanish tax authorities. However, what appears to be the case is that that €25,000 threshold applies per bank card, not necessarily per card holder or per contract holder, for example. Because of course, it can be the case where you have multiple bank accounts and you have cards in different bank accounts. Like for example, if you have, I don't know, a bank account with BBVA and then another bank account with Santander. If you spend 15,000 euros with one card and 15,000 from the other, in theory, neither BBVA nor Santander would report to the tax authorities because in neither entity the cardholder would have exceeded the 25,000 euro limit. Or maybe you and a family member, spouse, partner, whatever, you both have your own cards at the same bank, or even as part of one contract in the case of like a credit card, if there is an additional cardholder in addition to the main cardholder, for example. So in those cases, in theory, the reporting obligation wouldn't necessarily exist. It's not 100% confirmed or clear. The most clear statement I could find on the specifics of this was from Spanish financial blog Rankia in a post they've done on this new legislation, which essentially says, it's important to keep in mind that the 25,000 euro limit applies on an individual basis per card and not per holder. This means that if you use various cards and none of them exceed that number by themselves, there is no obligation to declare. Nevertheless, if a single card exceeds 25,000 euros in movements, the bank must inform Hacienda. And to clarify, that covers debit cards, credit cards, prepaid cards, and virtual cards, and it covers all kinds of operations as well, whether it's a purchase, a card top-up, a cash withdrawal, etc. All of this would fall in the scope of activity with the card that is subject to that 25,000 euro threshold. So thinking about this 25,000 euro transaction limit, what doesn't fall under that? Well, any cash transactions, of course, direct debits or bank transfers would not be subject to that either. Bizum transactions between two individuals, for example, you go out for dinner with your friends and you're paying back someone who took the whole bill for your part of the meal. That, in theory, shouldn't be reported either. And cards issued by non-EU entities, in theory, should not fall under this reporting obligation either. But the tax authorities could potentially request that information if there's a lot of activity via the common reporting standards. It's important to note as well that there's no action required from the individual side. It's all taken care of by the bank. So there's no, reporting or tax implications for you. But of course, if the tax authority have a look at your transactions and they see that it doesn't quite line up with the income that you're declaring, then that of course can raise suspicions. So looking at all of this as a whole, what does it mean for you living in Spain as a tax resident, as a business owner, or as a solo entrepreneur? Well, as we said throughout the video, there's obviously much greater visibility over what you're doing with your money. Whilst it doesn't necessarily mean more scrutiny immediately, of course, as I said just before, if things don't quite match up with what you're declaring versus what you're spending, or different transactions aren't being declared in the case of a business or self-employed person, then that of course can catch the attention of the tax authorities and it could lead to questions or a full audit. And so especially in the case of self-employed people and businesses, documentation is going to be very key to be able to justify any movements, transactions that have happened so that you can explain them if ever you are questioned by the tax authorities. Even in the case of individuals, if you're making a large purchase or whatever, or you think you are going to cross that 25,000 euro threshold, just having documents on hand like pay slips to justify your pay, lag receipts or invoices if you've made a particularly large transaction, this can all help cover you in case questions are asked. And the final point is something that I mentioned in another video I did earlier this year on a similar topic, and it's think before you do things with your money. If your family member wants to send you some money, or if you want to, take out a lot of cash or make a big cash deposit, think about what the implications of that are. Is there some kind of action needed, like formalizing a donation, for example, so that is documented and visible if ever questioned? Is there something that could raise questions, even though there's nothing inherently wrong with depositing or taking out money from a cash point? Because at the end of the day, visibility of what you're doing is now much greater than it was in the past. There you go, guys. I hope you found this video helpful and informative. Leave a comment and let me know if you think you'll be impacted by this new legislation. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. If you like this video and you want to see more about living, working in Spain and the bureaucracy that comes with it, then be sure to check out these two videos here. So next time, I'll see you on the next one, and let's get this money.